Are you ready to hear a story of deep love and painful betrayal? Have you ever wondered just how far a person might go when their trust is shattered? Before we dive into the twists and turns of this tale, I want to thank you for choosing to spend your time here. Your support means so much. If you enjoy stories of true crime and human emotion, please make sure to subscribe to True Crime at Last, where we delve into hidden truths and shocking revelations every week. Now, let us go on a journey that begins with selfless love and ends in a moment none of us saw coming. James, age 38, had always been a man of quiet strength and unwavering loyalty. He believed in the kind of love that many people only dream of. From the moment he met Emily, who was then 20 years old, he felt something stir within him that he had never felt before. She was kind, funny, and full of life. James quickly realized that every day he spent with her was brighter and better than the last. He loved to watch her laugh, see her eyes light up at small surprises, and feel her warm presence in his home. Over the 10 years of their marriage, James never once doubted that he would walk through fire if Emily needed him to. He was a man who found comfort in routine and commitment, though his heart was always open to new experiences if they could put a smile on Emily's face. On quiet evenings, they would sit side by side on the living room couch, talking about their day, the news, or small things like Emily's new recipe ideas. They planned out vacations, though some were more daydreams than actual trips. A week in the mountains, a visit to a remote island, or a simple outing to a nearby beach. James was ready to give Emily the world, even if his bank account fell short of such big ambitions. The love he offered seemed more than enough to keep them happy. When Emily turned 30, James noticed that she started to feel more tired than usual. She would lie down on the couch early in the evening, skipping their usual after-dinner walks. At first he thought she might be stressed from work or going through a period of low energy. But she grew even weaker, sometimes too exhausted to stand for more than a few minutes. Worried, James insisted they visit a doctor. After several tests, the diagnosis came. Emily had a serious liver condition. The doctors said she needed a transplant, or her chances of survival would drop significantly. James remembered how his heart pounded in the doctor's office. It felt like the very ground was pulled out from under his feet. Still, there was no question in his mind about what he had to do. The doctors did tests to see if James could be a donor for Emily, even though it meant surgery for him too. James was ready to do it. He signed every form without hesitation, ignoring all warnings about the risks. He was convinced that saving Emily's life was worth any danger to his own. The day of the surgery arrived faster than James expected. He wore a brave face for Emily's sake, even though he felt a churn of fear deep inside. Doctors said it was a major operation, and both of them would need time to heal. But James thought about their life together, about the days they had yet to live, and about his promise to be there, in sickness and in health. He would do it all over again if necessary. This was the kind of man James was: steady, loving, and determined to protect his wife from any harm. In the days leading to the operation, James stayed by Emily's side. Hospital rooms can feel cold and unfriendly, but he tried to make her laugh. He brought her favorite books, crossword puzzles, and even some homemade soup when the doctors allowed it. He wanted to show her that she was not alone in this trial. And in truth, James also needed to be close to her. He needed to see that little smile on her face to remind him of the love that drove him to risk his own life. The morning of the transplant, James could barely sleep. He paced around the small hospital room, looking out the window at the sun rising over the city. Emily was pale, lying in bed, trying her best to appear calm, though he could tell she was afraid. "It'll be okay," he told her, holding her hand gently. "We'll get through this together." She nodded, squeezing his hand in return. They were wheeled into two separate operating rooms. Everything happened in a blur of bright lights and medical staff. James caught a last glimpse of Emily's face before doctors placed an oxygen mask over his mouth and nose. He closed his eyes, trusting in the skill of the surgeons and in his own unwavering love for his wife. The surgery took hours. Doctors removed a portion of James's liver and transplanted it into Emily. Both procedures were delicate and lengthy, but by the end of it, the doctors declared the transplant a success. "He's stable," they assured the family. "She's stable too." James's relatives and Emily's friends breathed sighs of relief in the waiting room, thankful that both had come through the operation alive. Recovery was slow and often painful. James woke up in a haze, the surgical incision burning, each breath a reminder of the trauma his body had endured. His first thought, even before he could fully open his eyes, was of Emily. Nurses had to assure him that Emily was doing well, though she also needed time to heal. He tried to stand and walk to her room, but the nurses insisted he rest. Days passed, and James slowly regained the ability to move without crippling pain. Eventually, he was able to make his way to Emily's hospital bed. Her cheeks were less pale now, and she greeted him with a relieved smile. "You're okay," she whispered, her voice still weak. He nodded and sat by her bed, taking her hand in his. "We did it," he said softly. In that moment, James truly believed that their bond had grown deeper through this challenge. He hoped they would move on from this ordeal stronger and more in love than ever. Once the doctors confirmed both of them were fit to return home, James took time off work to care for Emily. He prepared simple meals, made sure she took her medication on schedule, and reminded her to take short walks around the house to rebuild her strength. Even though he was healing too, James made sure Emily's needs came first. Strangely, Emily seemed distant. At first, James assumed it was just the stress of the surgery or the side effects of her medications. She would sometimes sit by the window, staring out for long periods. When James asked if she wanted to talk, she simply shook her head and said, "I'm fine." At night, she tossed and turned, and James could hear her soft murmurs in her sleep. He tried to comfort her with gentle words or a reassuring touch on her arm, but she often pulled away, whispering, "I'm okay, just tired." James convinced himself that Emily simply needed time. After all, she had come so close to losing her life. Anyone in her position might feel overwhelmed by emotions they don't know how to share. He told himself that with enough patience and love, she would open up. Whenever he saw her lost in her thoughts, he reminded himself that everything would get back to normal once her health fully returned. But weeks went by, and Emily's mood swings became more noticeable. One day she would seem almost cheerful, telling James how grateful she was for everything he had done. The next day, she would snap at him for no apparent reason, telling him to leave her alone. He tried to approach her gently, offering to do fun activities together, like painting or listening to music. She would sometimes indulge him, but her mind seemed to wander, and her eyes lacked the spark he remembered. What James did not realize at the time was that something deeper was happening beneath the surface. He believed their marriage was still a safe, loving place, but hidden truths were boiling. Emily often exchanged text messages on her phone with someone, and each time James walked into the room, she would quickly put the phone down or turn the screen away. When he teased her about secret texting, she responded with a short laugh that did not reach her eyes. He felt something tighten in his gut, but he did not press further, trusting that Emily would tell him anything important when she was ready. Little did he know, his entire world was on the brink of collapsing. The warm home he had fought to protect, where he had literally sacrificed part of his body to keep Emily alive, was about to become a place of heartbreak and dark, terrible discoveries. James sensed a change, like a shift in the air when a storm is coming. but he told himself things would be okay. He had no idea how wrong he was. One afternoon, James was returning from a quick run to the grocery store. Emily had mentioned she was craving fresh fruit, and he wanted to surprise her with the best he could find. When he entered the house, he heard voices coming from the living room. Emily was talking to her best friend Anna, who often checked in to see how Emily was recovering. James was about to announce he was home when he heard something that made his blood run cold. He could not help but pause, groceries still in his arms, listening as Anna's voice filled the room. She said, "Does James know who the father is?" James nearly dropped the bag of apples. His eyes widened. Father? Father to whom? He stood frozen in the hallway, breath caught in his throat, heart hammering in his chest. Then he heard Emily reply in a low voice, "No, he doesn't know anything yet. I don't even know how to tell him." There was a moment of silence. Then Emily added, "The baby isn't his." James felt like the world around him started spinning. A baby? Emily was pregnant? How was it not his? A surge of confusion and panic filled his mind. He had never heard Emily mention pregnancy or any sign she was expecting a child. She had said nothing to him about this. And if it wasn't his child, then whose was it? He listened further, though he felt guilty about eavesdropping on a private conversation. Anna asked, "Are you sure?" Emily replied, "I'm certain. I'm not that far along. But I did a test, and I know when it happened." The moment felt both unreal and brutally clear. James wanted to burst into the room and demand an explanation. But he was rooted in place, shocked by how the words cut deep into his heart. Finally, Anna tried to sound soothing. You need to tell James. Or you need to do something about this. He just gave you part of his liver. This is serious. You can't hide it forever." Emily's voice trembled. "I know. I planned to leave after I got better. I didn't want him to be stuck caring for me, especially not after everything that's happened. But now, it's just so complicated." James felt his knees weaken. The grocery bag slipped from his hands, rolling across the floor. The fruit scattered, making soft thuds on the carpet. Anna gasped, hearing the noise. Emily's eyes flew wide, and she turned around to see James standing there, broken and speechless. The next few seconds felt like they stretched on forever. Anna quickly grabbed her purse, mumbled an excuse, and rushed out, leaving the husband and wife facing each other in the hallway. Emily opened her mouth as if to say something, but no words came. James's face was pale and tight with pain. His voice shook when he finally managed to speak. "Is it true? Is there a baby and it's not mine?" Emily's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded, unable to form a single coherent sentence. In that moment, James felt an unrelenting wave of betrayal wash over him, and he questioned everything he thought was real about their marriage. The days after the discovery were filled with silence and tension so thick it felt like a physical presence in the house. James felt numb. He would wake up in the mornings, stare at the ceiling, and remember that Emily was pregnant with someone else's child. Each time this realization hit, it was like a dagger to his chest. Every kind word, every gentle touch, every hopeful plan for the future, they all seemed tainted. Emily tried to talk to him, but what words could she possibly offer to soothe his wounded heart? Sometimes she would start to speak, "James, I'm sorry, but he would cut her off, shaking his head. He was not ready to listen. He needed answers, but he also feared what he might hear. One evening he could no longer hold back his questions. He cornered Emily in the kitchen, where she was preparing some toast, her eyes swollen from crying. "Tell me the truth," he demanded, trying to control the tremor in his voice. "Who is the father?" Emily closed her eyes, tears slipping down her cheeks. She whispered a name James recognized all too well. A co-worker from her office, a man named Brian. James remembered meeting him once at a company gathering. He had seemed polite and confident, maybe a bit too casual in the way he spoke to Emily, but James had never thought much of it. "How long?" James asked, anger building inside him like a raging fire. Emily swallowed hard. "It wasn't serious at first. We started talking about work, and then it turned into lunches. Then it just happened. I never planned for this to happen. But I couldn't stop it. And then I found out I was pregnant." James gripped the edge of the counter until his knuckles turned white. He wanted to shout, to break something, to demand how she could do this to him right after he risked his own life to save hers. But all that came out was a broken whisper. "You were going to leave me? After I gave you my liver?" Emily looked away, her voice filled with guilt. "I'm sorry. I felt trapped in this marriage before. I felt like you wanted a certain life, quiet, predictable, and I didn't know if I could handle it anymore. Brian was exciting and new, and I know it's wrong. But then I got sick. I couldn't tell you about the affair because you were busy taking care of me, and then you donated part of your liver. I felt horrible, James. But it was too late." James stared at her. He was at a loss for words. The woman he had loved so deeply had been planning to abandon him. That knowledge mixed with his raw anger to form an obsession. How could he ever measure up to the betrayal? How could he fix a situation where he had given so much of himself literally and she had already been in another man's arms? James tried to seek answers, but Emily's truth only fueled his fury. Her affair was more than just a fling. It was something she had considered building a life around once her health improved. She had been counting on James for support and medical care only until she recovered enough to walk away. James found his thoughts returning to one question: why? Every time he tried to rest, the question ate at him, making sleep impossible. He began to replay their entire relationship in his mind, searching for clues he might have missed. Had she been unhappy for a long time? Did she ever truly love him at all? Was he just a safety net until she found something better? In the middle of the night, he would wander through the house, staring at pictures of him and Emily from happier times. In one photo, he was hugging her from behind on a beach, both of them smiling into the camera. He wondered if that smile was real or just a mask for the camera. Another photo showed them at their wedding, arms linked, beaming at each other as if nothing could ever come between them. Now, James felt like every memory was a cruel joke. He told no one about this betrayal. His friends and family still believed that Emily was recovering well and that their marriage was as strong as ever. "How are you two holding up?" they would ask when they called or visited. "Do you need anything?" James would force a small grin and shake his head. "We're fine," he would lie. But beneath the surface, a storm was brewing, and he felt like he was facing it all alone. Night after night, the anger and hurt built up inside him. He found himself obsessively checking Emily's phone whenever she left it unattended, searching for messages from Brian. When he found them, each sweet line or affectionate word burned like acid in his veins. Emily would sometimes catch him with her phone in his hand. She would scold him, "James, that's private," but he could only respond with bitterness. "You lost the right to hide things from me when you went behind my back." His life started to revolve around one dark thought. How could he punish her for what she had done? He knew this was not healthy, but the betrayal cut so deep that he could not find a way to let it go. He felt foolish for having gone under the knife for her, risking his own life in the belief that their love was pure and eternal. Now, it felt like all of that was a lie. Desperation led James to do things he never thought he would do. He drove to Emily's workplace one day, parking his car across the street, hiding behind tinted windows as he watched employees come and go. He spotted Brian, the man he had once greeted politely at the company party. James studied him from a distance. noticing how Brian laughed with coworkers, how he walked with an air of confidence. James felt rage bubble up in his chest, but also a strange curiosity. What did Brian have that James did not? Why would Emily throw away a decade-long marriage for this man? When Emily found out James was lurking around her office building, she confronted him at home. "Were you following me?" she demanded, crossing her arms over her chest. James did not deny it. "I wanted to see him," he replied in a cold voice. "I wanted to see the man you think is worth more than me." Emily's eyes filled with tears. "James, I never said he's worth more than you. This isn't about who's better. It just happened. I can't explain it." Her confusion and guilt infuriated him. He shouted, "You can't just say it happened. You made a choice. And what about our vows? Our life together? Did any of that matter to you?" They stood facing each other in the living room, the tension so thick it felt hard to breathe. Emily sobbed softly, and James fought to keep himself from shaking her shoulders in frustration. He recognized that anger was consuming him, but the agony of betrayal left no room for reason. The more she tried to apologize, the more he resented her pity. He did not want her remorse. He wanted back the trust he had lost. After that fight, Emily decided to temporarily stay with Anna, hoping to give both herself and James some space. She was worried about the toll this was taking on their health, especially with both of them still recovering from surgery. James felt both relieved and tormented by her absence. Without her in the house, he had no immediate target for his anger, and his thoughts twisted themselves into darker shapes. He started imagining confrontations, running through different scenarios in his mind. Perhaps he would barge into Brian's office and expose him in front of everyone. Maybe he would tell Emily's family what she had done, turning them against her. Or he could pack up all of Emily's things and throw them out on the lawn, a public display of his pain. But none of these ideas truly soothed the burning in his heart. Instead, he felt an ever-growing urge to make her feel the same intense pain he was feeling. During this time, James also visited a therapist on a friend's recommendation. While he found it difficult to talk about the betrayal, he managed to share the basics. "My wife cheated on me. She's pregnant with another man's child. I donated part of my liver to her." The therapist offered words of sympathy and advised him to focus on self-care, reminding him that he had just gone through major surgery himself. James nodded. But deep down, he felt that the kind words could not soothe the kind of agony he felt. He tried to reason with himself logically. These things happen. People make mistakes, and couples sometimes face affairs. But logic failed him when he remembered the scar on his abdomen, a constant reminder of what he had given her. Each time he looked at it, his mind screamed, "You sacrificed everything for her, and she repaid you with a betrayal." Over and over, this thought echoed until it drowned out all sense of peace. One day, James received a text from Emily. It read, "We need to talk. Meet me at our house this evening?" He agreed, partly out of curiosity and partly from a desire to see her. When she arrived, she looked uneasy, her eyes red from crying. They sat at the kitchen table, facing each other like strangers forced to discuss matters they'd rather ignore. "I've been thinking about everything," Emily began, her voice shaking. "I can't change what happened, but I don't want it to end in hate. I want us to figure out a way to handle this together, or apart without destroying each other." James stared at her, 1,000 emotions crossing his face. "You're asking me to be okay with you having another man's child after I literally saved your life?" he asked, bitterness dripping from every word. Emily closed her eyes briefly. "I know it's a lot to ask, and I don't expect you to forgive me right away. But I can't go back in time. I'm keeping the baby, and I need to decide how to move forward. I wanted to see if there's any chance we can still be civil at least?" James's mind whirled. "Civil? He wondered what that even meant in a situation like this. He tried to collect his thoughts. Are you still seeing him?" he asked, voice trembling. Emily hesitated. "I haven't made any decisions yet. Brian wants me to move in with him, but I'm scared and confused. I just want some stability." Hearing this only fueled James's sense of loss. He felt an overwhelming surge of rage. But he tried to hold it together. The more she spoke about Brian, the more James realized she might actually be planning a life with him. He felt a cold, sharp clarity slip into his mind. Emily had used him in the worst possible way. He told himself that she never loved him, that her tears and apologies were just further manipulations. In that moment, he resolved that he would not let her walk away without consequences. A dark thought flickered in his mind, one that he had been repressing. She has to pay for what she's done. James's obsessive thoughts took on a life of their own. He started keeping track of Emily's whereabouts, searching for ways to catch her in more lies, to corner her with his anger. He would not rest until he felt he had regained control of a situation that had spiraled so far out of his hands. At work, he could hardly concentrate. His boss noticed the change in him, his once calm demeanor replaced by agitation. James often had to take breaks to calm down or splash water on his face. His co-workers asked if everything was okay. He gave them vague answers, not wanting to expose the painful truth of his personal life. But inside, he was unraveling. At night, sleep came only in short, fitful bursts. Whenever he closed his eyes, he saw Emily with Brian, smiling, holding hands, planning the future that James always assumed was meant for him and Emily. His mind conjured images of a child who would never be his but who would still call Emily Mom. The possibility of losing everything he thought was secure made him seethe with resentment. In the midst of this turmoil, a chilling idea began to form. He hated himself for even considering it. But the longer he brooded, the more it took root. If he could not have Emily, if he could not undo the betrayal, maybe he could have the final say in how this ended. The concept of bringing physical harm to her was something James would have once rejected outright. He was never a violent man. He was the kind of person who believed in kindness and second chances. But betrayal can twist the mind, and James felt twisted indeed. Still, he fought against these thoughts. He would watch old videos of them together, see Emily's sweet smile and genuine love from earlier days, and remember that once upon a time, they had a bond that felt unbreakable. A small part of him still hoped for a miracle. But as each day passed without resolution, that hope shrank, replaced by the monstrous whisper of his darkest impulses. Another confrontation came without warning. Emily dropped by the house to pick up some of her belongings. She knocked softly, as if unsure whether she was welcome. James opened the door, letting her in without a word. She began gathering clothes, personal items, and important documents. James followed her around, unable to look away, heart pounding with dread and fury. At one point, Emily paused in the living room, where their wedding photo still hung on the wall. She gazed at it, tears brimming in her eyes. James stood behind her, silent. Finally, she whispered, "I never meant for us to end up like this. I loved you, James." "I did." James let out a harsh laugh. "Loved?" he echoed. "Is that why you slept with Brian? Why you're carrying his child?" His voice dripped with bitterness. Emily turned to face him, tears falling freely. "I can't undo what I did. If I could turn back time, I would. But I can't. And you can't pretend you were happy either. We both know our marriage was complicated." James's anger flared. "You don't get to rewrite history. We were fine before you decided to be unfaithful." He stepped closer, towering over her. She took a step back, alarm showing in her eyes. "Don't come any closer," she whispered, voice trembling. For a moment, James felt a flash of guilt. realizing how threatening he must look in that moment, but the anger would not let him stop. He shouted, "You talk about regrets, but you just keep moving forward with him, don't you?" Emily swallowed hard. "I won't deny that I care about Brian. But that doesn't mean I don't regret hurting you." The complexity of her emotions only fueled James's hatred. He wanted a simple answer, wanted to paint her as the villain. Yet seeing her cry, hearing her words of regret, made him pause. Maybe, deep down, she did feel some remorse. Despite this moment of hesitation, the damage had been done. Emily hurried to gather the rest of her things, then left as quickly as she could. James stood alone in the living room, staring at the wedding photo. He remembered the vows he had spoken that day, the promises he had meant with all his heart. A tear rolled down his cheek, but his sorrow was quickly replaced by an icy resolve. If she was going to leave him, if she was going to abandon him after his sacrifice, then maybe there was only one way to end this cycle of pain. Not long after, James found himself unable to hold back the flood of despair and fury swirling in his mind. The idea he had resisted, the darkest path he could imagine, began to feel like the only escape from his torment. He told himself over and over, "She can't just walk away, not after everything I did for her." As this dangerous notion solidified in his thoughts, he started planning. The rational part of his mind told him to seek help, to confide in someone about his anger, to find a healthier way to cope, but he brushed aside those whispers. Pain had consumed him, and he saw no other option. He considered the possible scenarios: confrontation at her new place, a dispute at Brian's apartment, or something that looked like an accident. None of them seemed easy, and every plan he thought of ended in fear of the aftermath. But the more he considered the future Emily raising Brian's child, while James nursed his scar and broken pride, the more he felt drawn toward a terrible conclusion. One evening he sat at the kitchen table with a notebook in front of him. He jotted down fragments of a letter, something that might explain why he did what he was planning. He wrote about betrayal, about the humiliation, about how he felt used and discarded. Then he scratched it out, frustrated by his own words. No explanation could truly justify the path he was thinking of taking. It was madness, pure and simple, born of heartbreak and rage. Yet the heartbreak and rage continued to grow. In the reflection of a window pane, James caught a glimpse of himself. Dark circles ringed his eyes, his cheeks were gaunt, and his hair unkempt. He barely recognized this shadow of the man he once was. He remembered how he used to pride himself on being calm and rational. Now he was planning something that was both horrifying and irreversible. Every day that passed, he became more certain that the only way to make Emily feel the depth of his pain was through a final, brutal act. The last time James met Emily, it was on a quiet evening. She had come by to talk about the divorce papers. They had arranged this meeting in advance, hoping to settle the matter without too much drama. Emily wanted a clean break, and she believed James was finally ready to talk calmly. Yet the heartbreak and rage continued to grow. In the reflection of a window pane, James caught a glimpse of himself. Dark circles ringed his eyes, his cheeks were gaunt, and his hair unkempt. He barely recognized this shadow of the man he once was. He remembered how he used to pride himself on being calm and rational. Now he was planning something that was both horrifying and irreversible. Every day that passed, he became more certain that the only way to make Emily feel the depth of his pain was through a final, brutal act. The last time James met Emily, it was on a quiet evening. She had come by to talk about the divorce papers. They had arranged this meeting in advance, hoping to settle the matter without too much drama. Emily wanted a clean break, and she believed James was finally ready to talk calmly. When she arrived, James offered her a cup of tea, feigning politeness. Emily looked tired. Her pregnancy had started to show, and the stress of the situation was clearly wearing on her. She sat down at the table, folding her hands over her growing belly. James sat opposite her, resting his elbows on the table, trying to keep his voice steady. "So, you want to finalize the separation?" he asked. Emily nodded, her eyes downcast. "I think it's for the best, James. We can't keep living in this constant fighting and blame. It's not good for either of us, and certainly not for the baby." James winced at the mention of the baby, but he kept himself in check. They talked for a while about assets, the house, and other details. Emily said she would let him keep the house if that helped. She just wanted to move on. Maybe find a smaller place. James's heart twisted. Move on. That phrase stabbed him like a knife. She was moving on from their love, from his sacrifice. As if it was just a chapter in her life she was eager to close. A flicker of madness danced in James's eyes as he stood up and walked around the table. "You think this is so simple, don't you?" His voice shook. Emily looked up, alarmed. She noticed the rigid set of his jaw, the strange glint in his eyes. "James," she said softly, "you're scaring me." He stared down at her. "I gave you my liver. I saved your life," he said, each word quivering with barely contained fury. "And you repay me by leaving me, taking another man's baby with you." Emily got to her feet, stepping back as James advanced. "I'm sorry," she pleaded. "I never wanted to hurt you. Before she could finish, James lunged forward. He grabbed her arm, his grip bruising. She screamed, trying to pull away, but he held her tight. The teacup on the table rattled, tipping over, hot liquid spilling across the surface. Emily's breath came in short, panicked gasps. "James, don't do this," she cried. "Let me go!" For a moment, it seemed James might relent. His eyes flickered with uncertainty, as if a part of him realized the horror of what he was about to do. But the rage was too powerful, and the sense of betrayal too overwhelming. With a sudden surge, he pushed Emily against the wall. She cried out, clutching her belly protectively. He couldn't stop himself. The next moments blurred in James's Minda flurry of violence, the deafening sound of a furious struggle, and the sickening thud of Emily's body hitting the floor. Her terrified screams echoed in his ears. His vision tunneled, and he only saw red for anger, red for betrayal, and eventually, red for blood. When the chaos finally died down, he stood over Emily's motionless form, panting, tears streaming down his face. He dropped to his knees, horror gripping him. He realized too late what he had done. Emily lay there, her eyes staring at nothing, the life he once cherished gone. Silence fell over the house. James kneeled on the blood-stained floor, shock coursing through him. All the anger, all the resentment, had exploded in the most brutal way imaginable. He reached out to touch Emily's face, almost expecting her to flinch or blink. But she was still terribly, tragically still. His mind raced with 1,000 thoughts, but none made sense. He wanted to scream, to rewind time, to do anything to take back the violence he had unleashed. He thought of the child she carried, a child that was not his, and he realized, with sickening clarity, that he had ended 2 lives in his fury. For what felt like hours, he remained by her side, trembling and whispering apologies that fell on deaf ears. He glanced around the room, noticing the scattered documents, the spilled tea, the ring of keys on the floor. Everything looked out of place, as if an earthquake had hit. In a way, an earthquake had ripped through this house, his own mental earthquake, that shattered the last bit of love and hope. Eventually, the dark haze lifted enough for him to think about what to do next. His first impulse was to call the police, to confess what he had done. Another part of him wanted to run, to vanish, to escape the consequences. But there was nowhere he could hide from the horror of his actions. Even if he fled, he would carry this guilt forever. With trembling hands, James pulled out his phone and dialed 911. When the operator answered, he managed to say, I killed my wife. Please, send help." His voice broke on the last word. Then he dropped the phone, too overwhelmed to speak any further. As the wail of sirens eventually pierced the night, James remained on the floor, cradling Emily's lifeless body. He thought of all the years they had shared, the memories both good and bad. He remembered the day he volunteered to be her donor, the day he believed their love was unbreakable. Now, that very love was stained with blood and regret. The police found James in that position. They entered cautiously, guns drawn, not sure what to expect. James did not resist when they pulled him away from Emily. He was cuffed, read his rights, and placed in the back of a police car. Neighbors peeked from behind curtains, stunned by the flashing lights and commotion in a place they believed to be peaceful. At the station, James gave a statement. He spoke slowly, numbly, describing how he found out Emily was pregnant with another man's child, how he felt betrayed after donating part of his liver to save her life, and how everything spiraled out of control. The detectives listened in silence, exchanging glances as they pieced together this tragic puzzle. They saw a man who had been driven to the brink by heartbreak and jealousy. A man who had once been a loving husband but turned into a murderer in a moment of fury. The news spread quickly. Friends and family were in shock. They could hardly believe that James' gentle, soft-spoken, always ready to help had ended Emily's life in such a violent manner. Many cried, some pointed fingers, and rumors swirled. How could he do that? Did Emily push him too far? Why didn't they get help sooner? But no amount of speculation could change the facts. Emily was gone. Brian was left with an unthinkable loss. And James faced the legal repercussions of his terrible act. He was charged with murder, and the trial that followed was short. James did not contest the charge. He did not have the energy or the will to fight. He told his lawyer, "I deserve whatever punishment they give me." The courtroom was somber when the verdict was read. Guilty. James stared straight ahead, his eyes hollow, as the judge handed down a sentence that would keep him behind bars for many years. The scars he carried, physical and emotional, would stay with him for the rest of his life, a permanent reminder of the day he let hatred overshadow every moral principle he once held dear. In the wake of Emily's death, those who knew the couple tried to make sense of the tragedy. They remembered James as the loving husband who willingly risked his life to save his wife. They remembered Emily as the kind, free-spirited woman who somehow lost her way. The hospital staff who had overseen their transplant surgeries were especially shaken. They had witnessed a man give a part of himself to the woman he loved, never suspecting such a devastating end could follow. The small house where they had lived stood empty. Some people said they could still feel the echo of heartbreak in its walls. Others felt that the house was cursed, stained by a murder that shook the neighborhood. Eventually, it was sold, and the new owners tried to renovate and bring a fresh start to the property. But the memory of what happened there lingered in the community's collective mind. James's family, who had once admired his dedication to Emily, struggled with disbelief and sorrow. They visited him in prison, trying to offer solace, but there was always a wall of guilt separating them. He spent his days in a small cell, replaying the events over and over, a never-ending torment. He knew he could never take back what he had done, and he knew he had destroyed not only his life but also ended Emily's and their unborn child's in the process. Over time, people outside began to move on. Life continued, new stories arose, and Emily's tragic end became another cautionary tale told to remind others of how quickly love can turn into obsession and destruction. Brian, the man at the center of this turmoil, disappeared from the city, carrying with him the weight of regret and the pain of losing someone he cared about. No one knew where he went, but word had it he quit his job and left to start anew, haunted by the memory of how one affair led to unimaginable consequences. James, locked away, found no peace. He wrote letters he never sent, tried to detail the story from his perspective, but the truth remained the same. He had killed the woman he loved. The final line he wrote in one letter read, "I gave her my liver to save her life, and in a moment of darkness, I took it away." That line was the purest summary of the entire tragedy. Thus ended a tale that began with a hopeful, loving gesture. A story of unconditional love that devolved into betrayal, obsession, and ultimately, murder. It serves as a chilling example of how the strongest bonds, when tested by lies and infidelity, can snap with terrifying force. Thank you so much for reading this story. I hope it reminded you of how fragile our emotions can be, and how betrayal can drive even the most peaceful person to unthinkable actions. If you found this story compelling, please subscribe to True Crime at Last, where we explore tales of dark truths and tangled hearts. Your support means the world, and we look forward to sharing more stories with you soon. Stay safe, and remember to cherish honesty and understanding in all your relationships sometimes. Those virtues are all that stand between love and tragedy.